Hey everybody, it's been a week. I've not really been on this. Well, I've decided to do things a little bit differently this time. I'm playing with the audio a little bit. Wait, let me turn on the volume a little. Let's see if this will work. Alright, just so we don't have any feedback. Yeah, I'm still not the best at mixing the audio just because it's a lot of moving pieces and, doing it live while you're recording is annoying, but nobody really wants to hear how the sausage is made. They just want to eat. Oh, also last time I was chewing gum on the recording, so I kind of totally forgot I had the gum in my mouth. Yeah, I'm keeping it out this time. So yeah, it's been an interesting week. Joe Biden's president, the world is now functioning as it should, and world peace is now on the horizon. Yay! Bullshit. Yeah, I mean, nobody's really surprised. What was a big thing last week was the Redditors taking over the economy. Like a bunch of internet trolls decided, fuck hedge funds. And it was beautiful to watch, even though everybody that actually buys games and uses games knows that GameStop is a shit company. Maybe this will afford them the chance to, now that they've 20 times their net worth, something ridiculous like that, 10 times, they can actually use the investment to, get new stores, offer new services. But the love that we have for them is based purely on, their value is based purely on love that they got from the public rather than the actual value of the company. I mean, AMC is in a bit of a better position, a little bit, but I mean, if they can offer VR services, that'd be pretty dope, and just change up their facilities dramatically. But they're worried about when the shoe's gonna drop. And the only way it'll hold is if everybody decides to maintain their investment in GME and AMC and all these other companies. And there's also a big jump in Dogecoin, but Dogecoin's always been a troll coin, so I hope people had fun with that. I've been a little too busy just doing all this stuff. And it always feels like there's never enough time and I've never done enough, but I'm enjoying the journey. This week I'm working on API full time, just getting this wrapped up. And from there it's a series of small challenging steps to bring this tool to the public. Because at this point, the big deal is just being able to handle a high input of just people using the service at a time. And with that in mind, it's just been a crazy journey just getting that all to work out. It's because we just started moving on to different servers, testing hosting from different places, and code verification, quality assurance, all the fun stuff of being a big professional programmer, yay! But really none of the real spoils, because I'm not really doing this for the money right now. I mean, eventually I've got to get, I mean, I do, but these tools are meant more for the public, and I keep saying this, and I doubt anyone's going to listen to any of this for a while, but I guess it's more for my record that I do this. So what am I up to these days? I want to make more music. I just don't have. I keep saying I don't have the time, but really, my scheduling hasn't been as ideal as I'd like it to be. I recently started doing this modified Pomodoro. I'm not sure if I mentioned it last time. The tricky part of doing it is actually doing it, because I, of course, have to make it super hard on myself, so it's not like I gave myself the 25 and then 4 25-minute sessions, whatever, and 10-minute session at the end. No, I have to make myself do 90 minutes at a time and then 30-minute breaks, just so that I can watch TV. But whatever. And it's not even like I want to watch the crap, but it keeps me abreast of what's happening psychologically. Though when I switch back to audiobooks, my productivity does go up, and then I can use that relaxation time to, actually relax, make meals. Oh, which reminds me, oddly enough, I'm thinking of doing these on my fasting days, just because I have the extra time. My fasting days are Mondays and Thursdays, so Monday will probably just be me recording these, and Thursdays I could do a trippy Thursday sort of live stream thing, where anybody that wants to tune in can just come in, chat with me. I'll have the crazy VFX and maybe be doing like music mixing and all that fun stuff. So that'll be exciting. But yeah, my week's been very interesting, considering like I kind of cut off last week at what was going to be a very interesting point for me. Like I wanted to go on, but like it was not the time to be doing it. Right now I am working on just trying to understand sort of the alien environment and non-human persons, as I like to call them, just because it makes it more inclusive to sentient machines, living crystals, things like that. Yeah, 1 second. Let me keep it. Good lord. But this has been a fun journey, though. I keep saying that, but it has been. I don't think I've ever been happier. Which is bizarre as the world ends. And with that, I've just been going through the motions a little bit. Just because the way the schedule has been working out, I've got to, actually do the work. And having, going through the motions is a fun way of just making sure you go through the grind of it. Because every day is different, because the problems are different. There's no routine in terms of what I'm thinking about. And every step of the way has been very complimentary. Because it all builds on each other, the skills transfer well, and it's always interesting. Like, the puzzle's never the same. But the routine has been joyful. Because, I wake up every day now around 4 a.m., which sounds ridiculous to most people, but it helps that I go to sleep. I generally want to be asleep by 8 p.m., but then I wake up, 4, 3, 2 a.m. sometimes. It's not that big a deal. But my goodness. I mean, sometimes I sleep at midnight. But it's, nice to have that nice buffer room. But with the weird sleeping schedule, I also get a weird dreaming schedule. And the whole issue with aliens and all this mess is really that these guys, the galactic internet is telepathic. Like, just to put it out there, it's the easiest way to describe it. It's a massive web of information that our brains plug into. Like, this background that we're doing today is literally the universe. It's the churnings of the universe. It's layers of orbital resonance with the, what is it called? Large scale images of galactic filaments, clouds that we're zooming through, and the Buddha. And I'm constantly thinking and staring at it, but I like this. It's, in contrast to last week's, it's less busy, it's less, straight on the eye, but it's a lot more that's in the image. But it's so much more that it's inconsequential. Like maximal information becomes random entropy, like maximal entropy. It's things like that that bring me joy in terms of just understanding the way the world works and like exploring it all, you know. But with that in mind, it's just been this fun journey, just putting the pieces together, and just like I've built up a stock of these things, and part of why I'm doing this is just so that people can see them and have some, because like nobody really wants to stare at something like this for an extended period of time. I mean, I left it on with me last night, but and then I used them as meditation aids. And I mean, last year I released the videos with just the backgrounds, so I'm not sure if I release them in this version every time. But as I do this work, it's just getting more interesting and powerful and resonant with my mind, with my interests. And the funny thing about it is that the world that we live in has been this sort of thing that where there, like, how do I describe this? In like complexity theory, as it's sometimes called, there are points in tuning your system where noise becomes signal, becomes noise. And like one of the big things has been this idea of like so one of the things I've been studying has been the DMT verses, which is like trying to understand why the commonality of the experience is so resolute but still varied, and then there are different ways of navigating the ranges of experience. And you know, the idea is that the brain is creating more and more feedback loops as neurons are made more excitatory, and it's calorically costly to do things like that because our brains are, you know, evolved to do the minimum to keep us alive and comfortable, whereas to evolve as a species we've had to, in order to show off, you know, sexually, whatever. I guess it always does come down to sex when you're thinking about evolution, right? If you're doing the bare minimum to stay comfortable and alive, you're not doing enough to outcompete the other person that's, you know, trying to reproduce. And it's not even a matter of trying, it's just like the impetus of comfort and life like is to, you know, continue existing. And oddly enough, the self-similar recreation process that is evolution makes this fun process of, yay, we'll stay here forever, but we'll just keep popping out and copy mixing ourselves and interacting with the systems around us. And I love that, just because it makes the game fun. But with that, you also get this whole problem of the point of it all, you know? like, the owl does not ask the point of going after the mouse. And the funny thing is that humans probably didn't ask about the point of it all when we started this journey. But we got way too much time on our hands just because the easy parts of evolution of life were handed to us, at least, you know, as societies evolved, right? It's easy enough to find a partner now. It's easy enough to find a partner, but then the problem is finding a good partner. So yeah, that is the real issue, because then it compounds over time. Like, are you finding a partner consistently or a good partner consistently? And then if that line consistently finds good partners, do those good partners increase the reproductive ability of the individual? Yada yada. Let's get back. Well, I'm interested in getting back to aliens, but I don't know what other people are interested in hearing about. So that's kind of why I want to do the Thursday Trip Fest or whatever I'm going to be calling it. Trip Traps or something. Trap Trips. We'll come up with a better name as time moves on. Anyway, So when you have aliens and non-human persons coming into the fray and they see our species, and it's like, oh, what direction are they going? Because there's no necessity that these species exist within our three-dimensional frame of reference, right? They could come from outside of our frame of reference and be able to see our multiverse within 5 dimensions, and can then say, okay, these are the pathways the species can lead down very easily, because they're strange attractors in terms of, or I guess the better term is chaotic attractors, right? Like general chunks of possibility spaces that humanity exists in. If Archduke Ferdinand wasn't assassinated, maybe World War One didn't happen, but and then that creates this whole rippling effect of major changes. But you probably still would have had the atomic bomb, but maybe the war, a later event does happen, but it doesn't pull in as many people as World War One did. You lose, far fewer people. The world's a very different place just because the Archduke didn't decide to go, on his ride that day, or the guy that shot him didn't decide to go for a sandwich at that precise time. So it's like little things like that. So now, as a alien species, right? You come meet humanity, see them potentially going down all these pathways, and you're like, okay, what is in their best interest? What is in our best interest, being the aliens? And then what is of mutual interest, because ideally they'd want us to cooperate with them. I say ideally, but there's also the issue of not being seen as, actually human. The way the Native Americans were treated by the Europeans, right? White Europeans landed, they saw them living what were ostensibly Neolithic lives, or at least from the surface looked like Neolithic lives. And they decided, yeah, these guys are not worthwhile, they're savages, do they even have souls, things like that. And then once you're talking about the difference between species now, of course it's understandable that they'd see us not as being human or not sentient, like humans being less than makes sense in that purview. But yeah, it's always a mess. So from there we get to this challenge, right, of navigating the space of not just living comfortably, but cooperating with each other and finding mutual interest and mutual respect for one another. Because the way I'm speaking makes it sound like there's one alien, but being the universe, there's of course a multitude of them. Most just want to be left alone, just like most people. And it's interesting the way those sort of fractal realities bleed through interspecies relationships, interpersonal relationships. You even see this in the animal kingdom. Right? Unless it's a selective advantage for a species to behave a certain way, or for members of a species to behave a certain way, the behavior doesn't really last. Which makes some interesting queries about like the technologicalness of the human race. Alright, one of the fun things that I go back to this very often is the idea of previous incarnations of modern civilization. Like within this planet, just coastal cities that got flooded over by whatever catastrophe happened 100, 200,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago, while humanity was still on Earth, because the idea is that humanity evolved here 200,000 years ago. That's when you get anatomically modern humans. And yeah, sure, we're basing this on a fossil record / archaeological record, but there's some issues in terms of just the where we find them. Generally in remote areas. I mean, and then the idea being that you gotta dig deeper to get something from multiple millions of years ago. Because the reason why we are able to get dinosaur bones as easily as we do is just because, you know, they're dinosaurs, they're big bones generally, so you're able to find them more easily. And also, there's been enough time geologically for events to happen that would abduct and subduct tectonic plates, so mountains have risen over 65 millions of years. So, you know, you get places where they can be exposed, or, you know, people die in, or let's say the animal dies in an inland sea, the sea has dried up now, so over that geological timescale the fossil has been preserved and is now exposed because so much has happened. But in 200,000 years we've had massive periods of glaciation, and those don't really leave a lot of evidence just because, you know, wiping, cleaning, and humans don't really, like, if we did venture out into inland seas, those inland seas haven't changed enough for some geological event to have destroyed the Great Lakes, you know. Like, they're still there. Like, I mean, we still have some rivers, some seas drying up in the Middle East right now, so we may have evidence of human activity there, but like places like the Mediterranean, for instance, like, it used to be much lower than it is now, much lower, and then, you know, there's a massive event, seawall, biblical scale flood, probably killed thousands if not millions, well, let's keep it honest, thousands of humans just washed around and buried in the mud of the Mediterranean right now. Probably older than any fossils that we've ever recorded, but they're impossible to get to. But that's a non-issue, right? Let's say if 10% of fossils do get, you know, if 10% of bodies do become fossils, and that's a gross overestimation, right? That means the most recent one will maybe be 10% of the total existence of that species. Right. And that becomes an issue. The further back we go, the harder it is to get a resolute image of the age of the species. Just because the oldest known example of a species is only, you know, 200,000 years old or something like that, that does not mean that the species itself is 200,000 years old. And there's ways to test this too, right? We can measure ranges and rates of genetic variation and mutation across the species. But the thing is that humans supposedly mutate at a higher rate than other species. But part of me wonders if that's just like human propaganda just to make ourselves feel special. And the challenge of that becomes, now how does this let us interact with non-human species? And it's one of those things, right? Like, because our thought forms, our thought patterns, our language patterns are highly conserved down generations, but still mutate. You get, you know, stories from Indian cultures and Maya cultures and essentially any culture that managed to maintain its religious identity prior to, you know, the ages of the book. So let's say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You get stories of insane, I mean, even Christianity has stories of the flood, but that's a flood, not the floods. So that's the main difference here. And then if you're then charting human interaction with alien species across these multiple incarnations of modern civilization, then you start getting challenging problems, right? And I want to, like, just preface this by saying that, like, I'm not a big fan of the Anunnaki conspiracy theories, just because the evidence for them is scant, to say the least. But there's a grain of, let me just say, difficulty in terms of dismissing them outright, because there are evidences from like cultures like the Dogon, the Yoruba, who are African cultures, the Maya, the Sumerians. They all talk about, sky people flying, but these are sky people, not sky spirits. They're sky people. They look like humans. They act like humans. They take human wives, for God's sakes. And the story of the Bible is that the Nephilim were born, and the children born of them were giants and greats, which hints at genetic manipulation, or maybe just generations of good health and breeding, and then selective pressures. Because one of the interesting things I've been studying, right? There's this idea that humans and angels shouldn't mate, and it's weird to even like conceive of something like that. Because, right, one of the, I keep saying fun things, but it's the challenges that I've been dealing with in terms of charting through time has been this idea of giants, and whether or not it's humans experiencing acromegaly as a selective pressure. So acromegaly being, let's say after 30 you start growing again or continue growing, you never really stop, and it's usually caused by pituitary gland imbalances, and that sort of challenge makes it impossible to avoid just the mess of it all. Because, alright, as you get the species developing, having, groups of humans leave Earth, and then disaster strikes, meteorite impact, yada yada, nuclear holocaust, plagues, and and the idea being that you'd see evidence for this on the moon, you'd see evidence for this on Mars, you'd see evidence for this all over the solar system if humans have left the solar system before. And the weird thing about it is that, like, when I do the research for it, I do find the evidence, but it's always dismissed. And, like, I'm not, like, what to say about it is that, oh well, I guess we're covering it up just to keep society going. But at the same time, it's a challenge of saying, well, we know that something's up, because, we see this evidence of humans doing great things in the past. Like, talk less of Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids and what is it? The Acropolis in Athens, places like this where you see megalithic architecture, massive bones, like in Pumapunku, right? Massive bones, massive stones, sorry. And, like, it's clear that humanity's been up to some shit for a while, but there came a point, especially recently, where the society seems to have remembered and decided, a global culture decided to keep the memory alive in some way. And we get it passed down in our myth and the story of the zodiac and all this stuff. But society mutates at a much faster rate than language. So much gets lost. Cultures go extinct, languages go extinct, priesthoods go extinct. Even, like, what is it? Aramaic as a language, the one spoken by Jesus, is being threatened to be lost now, just because, the Bible was written in Greek and Hebrew, but mostly Greek, and that resulted in it being translated, and the language gets lost. I mean, we get Greek Orthodoxy, Roman Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy in terms of Christianity, and all these sects that pop up, but the original language of the prophet is lost. Isn't that ironic? And, like, it makes sense then why you have things like like Islam emerging and putting a premium on the language of the Prophet to keep some level of stability of the mythos and the ideas implanted in the culture, which makes sense, especially if you're trying to pass this knowledge down across the millennia. But my goodness, it becomes such a mess when you try to navigate these waters with modern day intellectuals, because the fate of the world quite literally hangs in the balance right now. Like, beyond like small things like global warming, and yes, I just call global warming small, like, because the scale of what's happening is mind fucking boggling. Like, so let's go back to Oumuamua, right? It's a piece of whatever moving through space faster than anything we've ever seen. If there's one object moving at this speed, there must be others. Just because it would be very unusual, incredibly unusual for something like that to exist alone. There are other objects moving at a similar speed, yes. Entire civilization, potentially moving at those speeds, okay. Remnants of those civilizations, their trash, their space battles, their debris, starts to get even more worrying. Now, once you start like looking at the necessities of an interstellar civilization and the scales of construction they can get to, that's when it starts getting horrifying, right? Because if you have an Oumuamua-sized object, which was the size of a, like, let's say a baseball field or something like that, a football field, right? That's a general scale of it. But instead you get something the size of a city block, something with the density of a car, but over the size of a mountain. Because these are all within the range of the construction of the spacefaring civilization, right? Because we need to build cities up in space. So now, let's say one of those cities comes crashing down. The impact is disastrous. And especially with something like what they talk about in the Bhagavad Gita, a war in the skies, right? But now, what if it's a continuous war between other species and we just happen to be caught in the crossfires? And that war that continuously happens, because it is net zero in motion in relation to the motion of the stars themselves, so every star in the galaxy moves through the plane of these self-destructive civilizations. And another self-destructive civilization at scale, right? So battling civilization millions of years old, if not potentially billions of years old. We've been here for 100,000 years, 200,000 years, 5 million years, whatever. But it's a billion-year-old civilization. Like, it's 1,000 million. Like, they look at us like they wouldn't even look at us. That's the funny thing about it. Like, even if we are intelligent, our ability to affect reality is so limited, and our understanding of the forces of nature are so small that, we're ants. And sure, you have occasional, like, people that, like to collect ants and study them. Like, we have entomologists for a reason. I'm not saying that they don't visit, but we don't create our policies to protect the ants, for the most part, unless they're going extinct. Which, hint hint, may be happening to humanity if we don't clean up our act. So, I'm like part of why I do all this work is just as like an uplifting project, like literally uplifting the species off this rock, and telling us how to get access to energy, like, and it's not even a challenge in terms of energy access. Like, the technology is there, but there's so much invested in keeping the status quo as is, and I think this is why this always consistently happens and why the splinter always happens, because there are always those that want to keep the status quo. Let's not change things. Oh, Noah, you're crazy. I'm not getting on your boat. Like, why would I get on your boat? Like, you're obviously a madman. That sort of thing. And then the floods happen, and you're like, well, I didn't build enough space for you guys because you told me you didn't want to get on the damn boat. So I guess you're gonna drown. I'm sorry. And thus you get civilizations that split off. So, and that's one of the craziest things about this too. Like, it's a challenge as a species to just get us to work in concert and understand the same things, because the benefit of diversity is that we can explore different niches, have different behaviors, and we're the ones that are becoming the new bison in a way. We're the new grazing animal. We're also the new apex predator, right? Our waste is being used to fertilize places, so we're the fertilizer. We're a linchpin species of the planet, obviously, at this point. And the responsibility of it is one thing, but then there's a responsibility for ourselves, which doesn't seem to quite, get through to people, especially those in power. Just because, when you're trying to maintain power, when you're trying to maintain your position, you're not really looking for reasons to doubt the importance of what you're doing. You are just doing your work. You're just trying to make sure that you get reelected and the polity is happy enough to keep reelecting you. And that's one of the problems with the civilizations that we have nowadays, right? We incentivize such short-term goals for ourselves that, even if you're trying to think across a 20-year timeline and behave across a 20-year timeline, you can the United States can barely manage it. We have 4-year election cycles, but major elections every 2 years. The disruption rate to our civilization is too great for us to plan and act on the long term. And you see a little bit better in China, just because socialism, yay. But even there, they're stuck on generational timescales. And the problem of space is that it's space. Everything is vast. Everything is amplified to ridiculous proportions. And we have been in a geologically quiet time on this planet for the last 50,000 years. Honestly, the last 50,000 years have been smooth sailing for humanity, even though we had an ice age, 19,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, and we came out of it, let's say 13,000 years ago, because of an impact event. So then you start to see, okay, these impact events happen often enough. And they happen across, and sure, we're starting to be able to, chart these things. But the problem is that if they're moving at the speed of Oumuamua, right, we didn't see Oumuamua until it was already leaving our system. If it was an impact, if it was, aimed for something, it would have hit. Nothing would have stopped it. We would have had maybe a couple weeks warning, if that. And it's not like we have space nuclear weapons anymore, because treaties that humanity made to keep ourselves from destroying ourselves may have also inadvertently set us up for destruction, because we were too cowardly to keep the weapons up in space that would be usable for defense purposes against these objects. But that's just my 2 cents on it. Let's get back to the aliens, right? So, you're an alien species and you see this, right? Okay. They can't be trusted with weapons in space because they're liable to kill themselves. But then they're also in the middle of a fucking shooting gallery, right? And there's no dodging these things. There are too many of them to dodge. Something's gonna hit. They always do. Especially if the density of these objects and the speed that they move with, is as crazy as some of the estimates seem to point at. Especially there's this idea that the torrid meteor stream was another one of these objects, but that's a more like intrastellar event. But then if you start mixing the torrid meteor stream with, interstellar debris, and you have collisions and gravitational tugging events happening that then pushes objects from the torrid meteor stream around and, destabilizing orbits in that sense, then you have even more impact events happening. Like, it doesn't just have to be that these objects are hitting us directly. Deflection is just too dangerous. And then there's, what's it called? Nibiru, Planet X, all that fun stuff. And that challenge has been even more. Oh, sorry. Been up since 4 a.m. And it's noon now, so I guess it's almost nap time, and I'm fasting. But yeah, so Nibiru, right, like Planet X, there is a decent amount of evidence that there is something out there on an oblong enough orbit that we can't see it, but it's definitely moving, and there's nothing we can really say about it because we can't really see it. And we've been looking for objects that are reflecting at the, what do you call it, infrared frequencies. But then if you start listening to the legends, right, about what these aliens were looking for, the Anunnaki, the ones that apparently came from Nibiru, which is another solar system, or another planet within our system, it gets to be this interesting issue of, oh damn, they're looking for gold dust apparently to seed their atmosphere to prevent its loss and maintain not just an electromagnetic field, just to keep the insulation on their planet going. And they need to harvest heavy metals from other places, which, as an interstellar species, is doable but very expensive to convert solar energy directly to, gold. It's much more cost effective to just harvest it directly, right? And when this is the sort of thinking that you have to do at a planetary scale, and you have deflections, you've got massive orbital activity, it becomes a challenge for a government to then tell its people, hey, remember those fairy tales we told you about that you grew up and are pretty much convinced are bogus? Yeah, there's some truth to that, and there's a good chance a good portion of the population is going to go. It doesn't sit well. Like, the public starts panicking. The people don't know what to do. It's a mess. And, like, part of the challenge in all this is just accepting that you can't really do much about it and just living your life. But the problem was knowing about it, right? Because now I've got this burden of proof issue where it's like, I don't have the resources to be putting up space telescopes. I do have the know-how to build telescopes, but it's still resources to get there, and like, building a spacefaring civilization, it's not cheap, it's not easy. In many ways, it's not practical if you want to maximize quality of life on the planet. It really isn't. But then if you know that in the long run life on the planet is unstable regardless, just because of impact events, right? Just because of, super volcanic explosions and things like that. The only way to survive is to create biomes in space. And I think that's part of why this issue keeps reemerging, and why we don't really see the previous incarnations of humanity, because in previous incarnations, I'm not sure if germ theory was really as big a deal the way we have it today, right? Because we could still have high physics without germ theory. We could still have relativity without germ theory. Which is, one of the fascinating things about this, right? We may not have quantum mechanics without germ theory, because that's a study of the small scale. So Germs are much bigger than atoms, so you get to atoms first. I mean, you get to germs first. But let's say you're a culture now that watching the stars, don't really care about germs, just call them spirits or whatever. You still value cleanliness. Nutrition is great just because megafauna are everywhere. The animals are large. The fruits produced by trees are massive. There's a consistent surplus in terms of food generation for the species. So then you've got a priesthood class, and things like combustion reactions are known, but then there are also like new ways of flying. I say new, but technically old. But energy storage becomes a not just possibility, but necessity. And then, like, we have like the Cup of Lycurgus, right, which is a Roman artifact that used, I think it's gold and silver nanoparticles in, I forget what the substance is, but some sort of glass, or maybe marble. I think it's probably a glass, but a glass made with a suspension of gold and silver nanoparticles, and it gives it this otherworldly glow. And that's just one layer of potential creation, because that's the same technology you can use to create quantum computers if you know what you're doing. But then it's a question of knowing what you're doing, and these are incredibly fragile pieces of machinery too. So a major earthquake destroys something like that. Like a major flood destroys something like that. Like the internet would not survive if we had a massive coronal mass ejection right now. And then imagine if you had massive amounts of cometary objects hitting the sun, and then those create coronal mass ejections. It becomes so obvious how unstable technological life is that we can't really deny it anymore. And it's not even depressing, it's just it's one of those things that I just can't, I guess I just kind of have to evangelize about it a little bit. And I'll get more into different things, because one of the fun things that happens is that once, I mentioned the galactic internet is telepathic, right? It's not like it's accessible to everybody either, even across the other species, because, there's just as much variety. Well, that's not true. Humans are quite diverse in and of ourselves, just because of the way genetic drift has happened across our species. It's been stable enough to keep life alive in Africa consistently throughout all these turmoils. But then the quality of life has swung massively over the centuries and millennia because of the mess of this. Right? We've got to navigate this before we can claim ourselves to be actually civilized beings, because we're only a step above animals right now, because our cooperation is still tribal. I mean, what is it? Chimps go to war with each other, right? Baboons go to war. Wars over territory, wars for resources. And once you're able to organize well enough and see that the resources are quite literally, for all intents and purposes, limitless, if you concentrate on long form ways of generating energy surplus, and then use that energy in different ways to produce and store food, produce and store housing, keeping non-issues. I just want human history to go on. I And like with that idea, that humanity may not go on forever. Like the extinction of humanity is not a. It's kind of boring. And I wanted to say that there's no way we can really survive as a species, but that's not what this is about. Because everything dies. Like, the species will eventually go extinct. If not by, an asteroid killing us, it'll be we evolved to the point that no anatomically modern humans are left. We've genetically modified ourselves and to the point where non-modified humans don't have enough of an advantage to be reproductively viable, right? It may be that we need genetic modification, whatever, machine augmentation, and then having a mix between those, right? What if certain genetic modifications are made that make us more easily interface with the machines, right? Maybe increasing the dendritic rate, the dendrification rate of our neurons or something like that, right? So it's easier to plug and play our nervous system in with other systems. So, or like boosting psionic ability would be another good one, right? Increasing the energy output to the brain so that it's able to transmit signals as low or high amplitude brainwaves are able to be transmitted and received by others. And then, you get whole new languages created, but people can't communicate, so they can't come and join in on the culture, and then because of that, they're lost. So the human race changes permanently. That's another thing that happens, right? Once you have a species that uplifts, or a subset of our species that uplifts, because the environment they'd be living in over 50,000 years, 100,000 years, even 20,000 years, would have been sufficiently different enough from our environment that they would have had different selective pressures that would have made them not like humans. So this goes back to the talk about angels, right? Angels should not mate with humans, and that's why we had the Nephilim, and then things like acromegaly, and then there are these like small mutations we see, and I see a lot of them. Like, humans have interesting traits across them. Like, people with only 4 fingers, they're much longer, stronger grips, things like that. Like, increased reach. Like, even the pygmy cultures, right? There's some talk that they're another race of, or because what happens occasionally is that the culture that does leave Earth comes back, but not everybody leaves the spaceship, So their culture bifurcates, and then some of them come back to Earth, and say, "Hey, we're back. Let's just make a life for ourselves here. We'll tell the stories of our ancestors to the children. We'll mate with the natives, and we'll do it." Because obviously, what happens is that there becomes a lack of genetic diversity up in space, just because I doubt humans have ever done this right? Get into space the right way. And it makes sense that we wouldn't have done it right over the last, 4 or 5 times this has happened. Just because we've never had it this much forewarning of catastrophe. Like, we have forewarning of catastrophe, but we still have to act on it appropriately. Like, this is another thing about, like, the story of Atlantis, because they were given forewarning too, right? The civilization, like in the myths and tales about Atlantis, they go beyond what you get in the Critias and Timaeus. Because the odd thing about it is that there are stories of Atlantis in African cultures that didn't get documented by the Greeks, because yay white people, like like. Whatever. So the story goes that they were given warning, But people didn't heed the warnings. You know, small geological events, larger scale, like omens in the sky in the forms of comets. Like, it's not a coincidence that comets are harbingers of doom across multiple cultures. Like, there's an ancestral memory of seeing lights in the sky and freaking the fuck out. But the funny thing about culture is that it's able to override a lot of our genetic predispositions. Usually it's good, we're less violent, but there's a question of even if we are violent as a species naturally. You could say, well, chimpanzees are violent, yes, when push comes to shove, but leave them alone, comfortably living decent quality of life. They're not really. Humans have always had the capacity for violence, yes. But would you have a cultural war with somebody because they, believe in a different god from you? Probably not. Like, that's wholly cultural. Like, the communism versus capitalism debate, seeing, its own chaos is another one of these things that you gotta deal with. And then now, non-human species, non-human intelligence, you come to the planet, you see humans being petty as fuck. You see your cousins genealogically being petty as fuck. You're like, well, fuck. These are the guys we're supposed to take up? We can't bring these idiots into space. They're gonna kill us all. Right? I didn't feel like I'd probably just keep harping on this issue again and again. But I don't know. Humanity is worth surviving, though, for sure. We'd be so good. We are so good in space. Let's just put it out there. Like, we are very good in space. I honestly think a decent amount of humanity now probably has spacefaring genes in them. Similar to the way, like, 2% of humanity has the genes inherited from Genghis Khan. Similarly, humans, if this theory holds through, will have had genes from, previous spacefaring iterations of our species, which may explain part of our high mutation rates, right? And then another thing is, like, the telomere lengths of our species are really weird. Just because, one, they vary, but two, like, telomeres lengthen based on the age of the parents when they gave birth to the child, right? So successively younger and younger parents giving birth to children means that the children will have successively longer and longer telomeres, which increases the rates of cancer for this species. And humans have a really disproportionately high rate of cancer, considering, we are humans. And the question is, like, how long is the natural human lifespan? And then what do animals die of in the wild? And whether or not it's the food that's killing them, right? And historically, like, humans were probably, like, obligate carnivores for the most part. Like, we did not need to eat vegetables. We did not need to eat fruit. Those are probably the treats, the candies. But we did eat meat. And that's another, like, worrisome thing as a species going into space, like having meat production. Because then that's either you're growing that meat in a lab, in a vat, whatever, which is doable, but challenging because it's a waste of energy to bring cows into space. We should. We really freaking should. But it's a energy suck to do that. We can bring insects into space and feed off of those as grubs, but that changes a great deal of the fundamental psychology of humans becoming insectivores. The efficiency, though, is incredibly high, so we don't want to really break that system. But if we're able to create a more diverse palette for the species, and then sustainably grow our life in space with adequate nutrition. Is humans, you know, very few people have meat allergies, but we have peanut allergies, pollen allergies, strawberry allergies, you name it. Any plant, somebody's got an allergy to it. So it's this sort of messiness in terms of the species. How do you make it safe to move humanity into space and then not have us eat ourselves because some great power failure? The systems that we create to survive in space have to be robust enough to withstand much more than just a few hits. But the problem is that if it's too robust and the people operating the system don't need to do anything, they're too stupid to keep the system going past a generation or two because there's no need for maintenance. And the system can't be too good is the problem. Like if the repair rate is 1 in 1,000 years, right? 1 repair every 1,000 years. By the time somebody's needed to repair the system, nobody remembers how to do the work. So then you die in 1,000 years. It's a mess. So then you've got to create oracle systems, AI computers that can actually, teach the people what they need to learn, but also keep them on track, keep the information alive, navigate monitor them, making sure they're healthy. We have to be our own cultivators, our own farmers. We have to shepherd ourselves. The animal husbandry has to expand to humanity. And of course humans are domesticated. We domesticated ourselves so that we could domesticate everything else. But then the question is, if we've domesticated ourselves, who is the shepherd? And that's where you have, the idea of rulers, philosophers, thinkers, yada yada yada, all these people, keeping us abreast of what we need to do as a collective consciousness, as a species, to keep ourselves healthy, right? But then the problem becomes we don't like to listen to people that tell us bad news because we're idiots. By and large, humanity is still mostly animals, so we do animal things that make us uncomfortable. We fight, we seek comfort because it is easier to live and reproduce in a comfortable environment. It's easier to, without stress, to put on the calories, to put on the muscle mass, to flex and raise the kids. If they're not worried, you're not worried. Simple things like that. But it's worthwhile in the really long run, because that's kind of my challenge, right? I'm stuck on such long-term timescales for everything that it's beyond human necessity for a single lifespan, and it's kind of just in large part an academic exercise, but an academic exercise with such real-world consequences that I can't ignore it. So I've got to do the work. And I can't convince other people to do it because the evidence is hardly there to begin with. And the people that would be able to do it are busy. And those that aren't are like Jeff Bezos and whatever what's his name? Richard Branson and all these other billionaires trying to create space programs, right? But rockets are fucking stupid. Because the billionaires creating space programs are not the people that are designing new systems to get into space. They're licensing old technology. And the V2 rockets were created by a guy hired to create rockets as weapons. They're modified weapon systems. They're not perfect. They're not ideal for getting anything into orbit. They're fast, but they're incredibly inefficient. So you can't move the entire species into space using rocketry. It's just dumb. And we can get better rockets to move small percentages of humanity into space, sure. But if you really want to do this in time, we have to actually get into, fusion drives, nanoscale production, things like two-dimensional, like, material science hoopla. And, like, the conspiracy guys are always saying, oh yeah, the technology is there, it's just, classified and all that shit, but we don't have a lot of time. Let's say, like, over the next 100, 200 years, right? We'll see more and more class objects emerging, and they will do damage. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They move fast enough to do some serious harm. It's a challenge, though. Worthwhile. That's why I do this work. There's nothing else. Like, it was the highest purpose I could possibly find. Like, quite literally. Like, space high. Yes. But it's madness. It's quite literally madness if you're living on the scale of a day-to-day human life. Like, this is the evolutionary leap. This is the great filter. This is literally the great filter across all species of our galaxy. Because the refuse of whatever mass is up there will consistently, across the entire galaxy, keep other civilizations from emerging, because it will consistently knock them back down. This is the great filter, and we're looking at it. We've seen the first hints of it. And if we don't act accordingly and appropriately, it'll take us back down. And what are we going to do about that? Probably nothing. The nomads live on. The people living in, like, Alaska, like, highlands live on. And, like, people living in the middle of the country probably survive well. New York is toast. The big cities are toast. Chicago's toast. Like, actually, no, maybe Chicago could do some well. But that's if there's no glaciation that happens right after this, too. So that's another problem, right? The weather patterns change, so it's not really the impact that kills us, it's the starvation, the inability to farm properly. Which is why I want to get into energy production, because if we can get to fusion power, not solar, fusion, or even wind power, we can use wind power in the event of a actually, there are issues with wind power in a post-apocalyptic situation like this, because the dust in the atmosphere creates a damaging mist debris for any, wind farms. The blades on the windmills get damaged by the dust in the air, so they're not sustainable. And that's the point of this, like, sustainability. Geothermal we can have, but the crust of the planet still moves around enough that eventually any point that is geothermally active will have sloshed somewhere else over a long enough time scale. So what energy sources can we create that'll last on the scale of 1,000 years? And the only thing that we can do that does this is a space infrastructure. We need an infrastructure in space to generate energy to keep the species functioning past extinction level events. And that's the sort of thing that really creates a mess, because that's international collaboration at a scale that has not happened at all. Maybe not for tens of thousands of years, and look at how well they fared. We clearly don't see evidence of them now, right? So what do we do then, right? If you gotta get international cooperation to build cities and power plants and all this stuff in space, just so that we can then keep what little we have on Earth going, it's not enough. You gotta spread this out even further. Hey, we can dig into the mantle to a point. Like, there's evidence to suggest there's intra-Earth civilizations and things like that, and they had their own different set of selective pressures, so they've diverted enough from humanity to not really want to fuck with us anymore. Like, literally not want to fuck us. Like, we're gross. And likewise, like, the aquatic ape theory, some of us have branched off to become mermaids and whatnot, but the evolutionary timescales needed for something to happen like that are so much greater than 200,000 years that, yeah, if they're intelligent, they want to avoid us. It's just common sense. Look at the way we murder each other. Of course, you don't want to murder them. For the last 10,000 years, we were murdering everything else we saw on this planet. Like monsters got killed. You know, children born deformed got killed. There's a little bit of annoyance in my voice over this, just because I know it's insane to the common ear. Just because it's not the live, make work, reproduce, have children, watch TV, buy stuff, die. It's animal husbandry, it's human cultivation, it's doing what we have to do to keep the species going at a scale that's interesting enough for another 10,000 years. Just because, I'm just looking at this from the point of, our great-great-grandchildren.